So here's just two pieces of paper. You can't tell much of a difference between the two, except one's a different color than the other. However, if we use our light panel, then we'll see a great deal of difference between the two. Now we can see a big difference. This, the color is more prominent, but it's thicker. And this paper has these odd lines on them. Well, we're going to talk about that now. So these are what we refer to as Western papers. Papers made in Europe and in North America since about, I don't know, 1200 or the 13th century. Now, this would be the first one I'm going to talk about. And again, this is not a comprehensive history of paper. That would take a lot longer than just a short video. But essentially, I'm just going through, with as much information as I can possibly manage, the difference between the papers we might choose to make repairs. So, this is a laid paper. Specifically, it's called an antique laid paper. And there are two differences between just regular laid paper and antique. But primarily, the reason it's called laid paper is that laid paper has these lines in it. See these lines, these tall, prominent lines? These are called chain lines. And you can probably see it running perpendicular to them are lots of little tiny small lines. Those are called laid lines. Now what these represent is the lines are wires. They're metal wires. These are the bigger ones. And off of those run these smaller laid lines. And they're attached to a wood frame that goes around a mold that someone with their hands would dip into wood pulp, which is a slurry of paper fibers and water, and produce a sheet of paper by dipping it in and pulling it out. And when the paper dries, you end up with this pattern. This pattern shows the chain lines, and it also shows that it is an antique laid paper because if you notice, on either side of the chain lines, there's this kind of cloudy effect. And it's darker. Well, it's darker because there's more paper pulp in this area, as opposed to the lighter area where the line or the laid lines are. There's less pulp. The reason is because the wire is in the way and the pulp can't deposit there. Now, another type of laid paper, let me just move this aside, is this one. Notice it looks very different. It doesn't have the cloudiness along the chain lines, but you can very much see the laid lines as well as the chain lines. This is what's called laid paper. This paper itself, this piece, is from the 18th century. This paper was made probably sometime in the mid-20th century. The manufacturing processes are much different than they were for this. The reasons are just slightly the way they manufactured the molds versus a handmade laid paper of the 20th century. The molds don't use the same materials. But those are the rough differences. They're about the same thickness paper. Okay, so let's choose another laid paper, which is this one. Now you notice what type of laid paper is it? Does it have cloudiness along the chain lines? Yes, it does. This would be called an antique laid paper. Although this was made in the 20th century, it was made in the same way as this one was made. Another laid paper is this one. Now this illustrates a couple differences. You can sort of barely see the chain lines. Barely see them. Barely see them. Paper is made of 2 or 3 different types of materials historically. One is cotton, the other is hemp, the other is linen. Now, this is made of mostly cotton. However, this paper, if you notice, it just seems like it's got kind of extra long fibers here and there, and it just has a more mottled appearance. This is paper made with linen, and linen was more, as well as hemp, the more dominant material papers used earlier on, 15th century, 16th century, 14th century. That was more predominant to use hemp in general for a variety of reasons, like in ropes. But that's why these papers can look very different, and they're made the same way. Let's look at another one. This is just a different version of the same thing. Now you see how it's just cleaner. This is just another laid paper. Now, these are all Western papers, what are referred to as Western papers. Most of them are made in Europe, not all. However, laid papers were also made in the East. And this is one example here. This is what's called many people call a Japanese paper, but it's made of a different type of fiber that comes from a shrub. I believe it's called kozo. The shrub might be named kozo. But these fibers, notice there's a chain line. Notice the chain line. And it's hard to see here, but there are laid lines as well. This is about the same thickness, but this is a Japanese paper. And a modern paper made in early 21st century. Here's another Japanese paper, a laid paper. Again, you can see the chain lines, and you can see the very small laid lines running perpendicular to it. Much thinner paper than this one. Now, another one. You can barely see it, and notice there's all of these odd fibers in them. This is made from an admixture of different materials, hemp and kozo. And then finally, another Japanese paper with very prominent chain lines, much more closely spaced than these, and then the laid lines. This is another fine Japanese paper that's used in repair a lot. All of these papers I'm showing you are used to repair paper-based artworks, historic documents, family documents, photographs, anything at all made of paper. These are papers that you would choose. Now, I said there is another category of paper. The other category of paper is called wove, which is what I showed you initially. This is an example of wove paper, Somerset, made in England. And you know what? It says it right there. You don't even have to guess. Now, this paper shows several things that I'd like to talk about on the wove paper. It's very uniform. You notice there's no chain lines, there's no laid lines. The paper pulp looks very evenly distributed. It's one of the great characteristics of wove paper. And wove paper came into its own commercially or in a manufacturing sense about 1800. And one major advantage of wove paper is because it could be made mechanically. It could be made by enormous machines and produce even larger and larger sizes of sheets, as well as giant rolls of paper. Another feature this shows is something that you'll see on laid paper as well. Let me see if I can find the right piece here. Okay. Each sheet of paper is made on a mold, as I said before. That mold has a dimension. It's a certain width, 10 by 14 inches, for instance. Well, the outside of that is kind of an irregular edge where it hits the mold. See this edge right here? It's kind of very thin paper. This is kind of raggedy paper. So there's two edges right here that are the mold edge. This is a cut edge. These are called the decal, D-E-C-K-E-L, D-E-C-K-L-E, excuse me. And this is the decal edge, or just simply the decal. Same thing here. That's the outside of the sheet as it was made, whereas this is cut. And sheet sizes only got up to a certain size in the laid sheet category because it was ultimately how large a mold a man could place into and lift out of the vat. When wove paper came into effect, you could make, well, enormous paper. And you could make endless paper because they figured out a way to make paper off of a roll in a vat continuously. Hence, that's why we've all gotten newspapers in the past 200 years, because you can produce enormous amounts of paper. The other thing this shows is something that's called a watermark. Now, many people now are only familiar with a watermark when they use Microsoft Word or Adobe to make a PDF to put a watermark on their stuff. You might see a watermark on your check or a watermark on a $10 or $20 or $50 bill. What a watermark is essentially is just generally a wire that's been woven into the screen in whatever form you want, a word, a picture, a picture of a bird, of the date, whatever it is. And where that wire is, there's going to be less paper deposited, and hence you get a watermark. Now, let me just leave this here. This is another type of wove paper. And this shows a couple of different features on it as well. This is made from linen as well as cotton, and it has a kind of a hairier look, right? It's less uniform than this. This is a wove paper that was made about 100 years ago. It has another interesting little feature too. See these little dots right here? These are made by water, right? And they're made by water, and why are we seeing through them more so? Same reason this is. There's less pulp there. Why is that? When this paper was made, a drop of water or sweat, if this was handmade, got deposited on this piece of paper when it was brought up in the mold. And because it got deposited there afterward, it pushed aside some of the pulp. So this little piece of paper here shows that clearly. All right, another wove paper is this one right here. I'll put this right up here. This is made by Crane's paper. It tells you clearly it's made 100% cotton. This is an excellent paper to write very permanent documents on. If you're going to have a permanent record of something, you want to buy a paper that's 100% cotton. Because this paper, this piece, if just put in a folder somewhere and set aside, it'll last 400 or 500 years. I don't know of any electronics that are going to last that long. They barely last, 10 or 15. And there's no need to reproduce this. It's on excellent paper. Crane paper has a distinction. This company has been around for a long, long time. They still make the paper that is used in our United States currency. And who knows, they might make paper for other currencies. I have no idea. But they've been making paper for the U.S. currency for a long time. But again, wove paper, very uniform. Clearly it's 100% cotton. And then finally, one more sheet, which is just another brand. It's a wove paper, and it's made by Arches in France. And this is just their little infinity symbol. This is their watermark. And there you can see, what is this? That's the decal edge. That's the decal edge. You can see where it hits the frame. This is not a decal edge. This is where I tore it in half versus cutting. See, that's a cut edge. This is a tear edge. Now, when you do a lot of repair work, you never use repair pieces that are cut. You always use something torn, and the decal edge is actually really favored for that. Okay, these are mostly Western papers that I've been showing you, but I have shown you a lot of Japanese papers, or what people in my business refer to as Japanese paper. But they could be papers manufactured in China, in Japan, Singapore, Korea. They're just often referred to as Japanese papers. And they come in a variety of sizes and thicknesses. And we concentrate on these because we use Japanese papers a lot in repair work. So for instance, if I wanted to make a repair strip, I would use a Japanese paper. And one of the benefits of Japanese paper is they're made of very excellent materials, and they have very long paper fibers. Now, if you look at this Western paper, you see the fiber length with this tear, very short, tiny. That's not to say that this paper is not fantastic paper. It is. I use this all the time to repair. But you choose a paper based upon its characteristics to make the repair that you need to make with it, structural purposes as well as aesthetic purposes. Each has its benefit, none better than the other, but they must be appropriate and sympathetic to the repair. Now here's another Japanese paper. See how long these paper fibers are. What's important about concentrating on these fiber lengths is that when you make thinner and thinner strips, say you have a strip this thin, the paper fibers, they're like little fingers that grip. So when you apply adhesive to these, and the adhesive is very thin, those fibers that stick out from the body of the men do a lot of holding. So if you have a paper that's ripped, like say this paper is ripped and you want to put it back together, you would make a strip a lot thinner than this, maybe 2/3 thinner, and you put it on top of it and adhere it to put it back together. So you always want to use a very thin paper, but the papers with the long fibers do a great job of holding down without adding bulk and a lot of weight to the item you're repairing. Because a repair is not just structural, it has to be aesthetically pleasing as well. So you can have papers this thick. There are Japanese papers that are even thicker than that. This is much thicker. This is about as thick as this one. Now, when I say thick, this is about twice as thick as this paper. They're described by their gram size, G-R-A-M. In other words, this is 10 grams per square meter weight. This is 30. In other words, if you cut a piece of paper, this paper, 1 meter by 1 meter, a square of it, it would weigh 10 grams. This is 30, it would weigh 30 grams. If you got very thick Japanese paper at 100 grams, that means that that large piece would weigh 100 grams. That's a very thick paper, by the way. We use mending papers that are 10, 5, 3, 2, and yes, there is a 0 paper. That doesn't mean it has no weight. It just means that it's so thin that it's hard to measure. So this paper I'm showing you now, this is, see how it's much thinner than this one? This is 5 grams. I was wrong. This is 7, and that's 20. If I look at the actual sheet of paper on it, that's about 3 to 5 grams per, okay? It's not all precise. So when you call it a 10-gram paper, it might be 8 to 10. You know, there's some variation, but it's really thin. Then there's this one, which is even thinner than this. And I don't know if you can even see the fiber lengths because it's so thin on this whiteboard, on this light panel. But this is very thin, and this is the kind of repair paper we make. We might even repair a paper that's this thick with something like this. So these are the variations that you have in repairing. There's also something else you can do when you repair. If something doesn't look like the color you need for your repair, let me just put this here. You can always color it. So this is just using watercolors on the Japanese paper to get different tones. Now, if the light panel is off, you'd see more of the color. Let's see if we can do that. You see the color? And light back on. So there's a lot of different papers you can use. Now, I do want to go back and talk about something else. And I'll bring these back maybe a little bit in just a sec. But one thing I want to talk about is it might not make sense on the description of these laid lines. So let me get these out of the way. Let me just describe what kind of it is. So right here, you have a chain line, chain, 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 right? So if you could somehow tip the paper on edge and magnify the thickness of the paper to its extreme, let's say the paper's this thick, okay? And where those chain lines are, the paper actually is like this. And it's a little bit raised up here, right? It's a little bit raised. A little bit raised. And the same thing on the bottom, right? Same thing on the bottom. A little bit raised. Right? And down here is this light panel, right? We're up here. The chain line you're seeing right here, you're seeing a lot light coming through it because this thickness is less than the overall thickness of the paper. There's more pulp here than there is here. So you're seeing this as darker and this area is lighter. And the same thing at each of these chain lines. So that's what you're seeing through the thickness of the paper. That's what it looks like if you were able to magnify the thickness of the paper like that. That's what you'd see. And these little bumps I kept drawing, that is not like this line. That's like, where's my antique laid paper? That would be like the antique laid paper like you see here, right? This is the cloudy part is a thicker pulp. That's what you're seeing here, these little bumps. So that's what that is. Let me just see if you can't even see that, can you? That. And also why it's tough to do a light panel. Now, another thing about paper in general is when you're making repairs, and this is about doing repairs. If you don't have a repair that's the color you need it, you can just color it. So this is a repair that I'm making for a missing part of a map, and I don't have that color. And I need that kind of color in order to make the repair. So I'll just paint it. Same thing with this one. I'll just paint it. Let's see, maybe you can see the front end of this. See, I painted this with acrylic paint. This one I painted with watercolors. Look at the back side of that, see? Now this is a thick Western wove paper. So if you need, and they need to blend to make in repairs, what you're doing, you can color them before you make the repair. I just wanted to show you this as something that can be done, and you don't have to try to buy every paper under the sun of every color. If you need a color, you just make it. And you can make all sorts of patterns and colors, and when you make the repair to your artwork, you can make it disappear if you need to. Sometimes you don't. Now, let's just say you have a piece of paper that's got a hole in it, like a weird irregular sized hole, and you need to make a repair on it, okay? So let's say you come home, and your cat chewed a hole in something. Now, people more than once have come to me with that exact problem. There'll be scratch marks in it, claw marks. The cat's chewed something, or a dog has, or a kid, or whatever. Or insect damage is often a way that things get damaged. And I mean from mice all the way to beetles and bugs. And you have to repair this piece. So knowing, would you use this paper to repair it? This antique laid paper? Because it doesn't look anything like this paper. Would you use this Japanese laid paper? Maybe it's good quality repair paper, but again, if you were to look at this paper afterward, you'd know this was a repair. Well, the answer is no. What you're going to do is you're going to find a paper that will be appropriate for the repair. And what appropriate means is not just mechanically sound, but also the right paper aesthetically. It's got to be pleasing to look at too. It's not just something to do. So you might go for a Japanese paper that's about the same thickness. You feel the thickness of it. That looks like this. So when you cut this item out, you tear this item out from this Japanese paper and you put it in place, it will look like wove paper. That's why you want to know what antique laid paper is versus wove paper. So when you're making your repair choices, you've got something to go on that you didn't have before. So that's an example of that. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to pick the right paper for the structural reasons and the right paper for aesthetic reasons. Those are two things you got to do in order to make the right repair. And in another video, we'll talk about the whole repair process. This is just really an introduction to the different papers that are most commonly used by people who make repairs, by conservators and art restorers and people who do repair work. It's making repairs that are sympathetic to the historic document, to the object, to the artwork, to whatever it is you're repairing, that makes them structurally sound and visually non-distracting. Now, in art conservation, you're not trying to hide the repair, but you're also not trying to make it look obvious and make it look like a 4-year-old did it. In art restoration, you are trying to make the repair so that it cannot be seen. Now, that might sound similar, but they have two different goals in mind. But they use the same materials. So that's the rough overview of paper. We'll talk more about paper when we get into the actual repair process, specific papers you're going to choose for specific repairs. No different than you choose specific papers for hinging your artwork in a mat or on a backing board before you frame something. So thank you for your patience, and I will try to supply a list of paper companies and sources for these papers. Most all aren't really that expensive, and you can usually get them in small enough quantities that you can just buy what you need instead of buying huge quantities that you'll never use anymore. But enough to be able to get you started and to do all sorts of repairs for not only your stuff, but it's like any other talent or skill that you develop. People end up finding out and they'll come to you to help them out, which is always a good thing because that increases your chances of developing your skills even further. So thank you very much, and that's all for today. Thank you.